Who are you? A stranger's muffled voice echoed through the living room I had poured my heart into designing. The room reeked of cheap beer and greasy beef chili. Returning home to my quiet suburban house after a 3-week business trip in Europe, an unnatural atmosphere enveloped the space. I had a bad feeling the moment I opened the front door. My mother's neatly arranged shoes had been kicked carelessly into the corner of the foyer, replaced by a pair of strange black leather boots and bright red high heels that shamelessly occupied the entryway. With a sense of dread, I opened the living room door and was met with an unbelievable sight. At the center of the room sat the custom cherrywood dining table I had commissioned from master craftsmen, especially for my mother. Now, it was stained with grease, holding an unfamiliar, tacky pot bubbling with chili. Lounging at the head of the table, drinking a beer, was a strange man in his 50s. Next to him, a heavily made-up woman of the same age was carelessly tossing the premium Wagyu beef I had ordered as a gift for my mother into the greasy stew. Trashy reality television blared from the screen at maximum volume. Then, my eyes stopped at the darkest, coldest corner of the room. There, standing on the cold kitchen tiles, was my mother. She had made herself as small as possible, banished to the corner of her own home as if she were not even allowed to sit in a chair. The moment she saw my face, she gasped, then looked down with a heartbreaking expression of pure guilt. Her wrinkled hands tightly gripped the hem of her worn-out apron, trembling slightly. Looking closely, she did not even have slippers on. The warm, fuzzy slippers I had bought to keep her feet warm in the winter were currently being worn down by the strange woman. I did not yell. I did not slam my suitcase onto the floor. I did not scream. And I did not immediately interrogate the two strangers. I simply kept my hands in my coat pockets, gripping my smartphone so tightly it felt like the screen might shatter. Suppressing my violently pounding heart, I observed the two of them with ice-cold eyes. I already knew exactly what this situation was. "Excuse me, are you listening?" The flashy woman glared at me while stuffing her face with the premium beef. "Don't just barge in here. This is our house. Our house." The moment I heard those words, a cold flame of absolute fury quietly but surely ignited in my heart. After my father passed away early, my mother worked 2 jobs, cleaning office buildings at dawn and scanning groceries at a supermarket until dusk, just to raise me on her own. I spent 10 years saving every penny to build this house for her. As an architect, I put my professional pride on the line to create a sanctuary where she could age in peace. I eliminated every step and threshold so her weakened legs would never stumble, and I widened the hallways so a wheelchair could easily pass through if ever needed. It was a place designed solely to heal her decades of hardship. "Oh, wait, are you Maya?" the man asked, clapping his hands together as if remembering something. He slammed his half-empty beer glass onto the table. Condensation dripped down, soaking right into the flawless cherry wood. "Sarah told us about you, said you're always overseas for work. She was bragging about what a successful daughter she has." The man smirked, completely unapologetic, picking his teeth. "I'm Kevin. This is my wife, Michelle. We're your mom's distant cousins." Distant cousins. The phrase rang a faint bell. I recalled hearing about some relatives from my mother's rural hometown who had begged for money decades ago, but they were people we had not interacted with once in over 30 years. "I know you just got back from a trip and you're tired, but as you can see, we are taking care of Sarah here," Kevin said, looking down at me as if he were the master of the house. Family helping family in times of need. It's only natural, taking care of her. The overwhelming contradiction and sheer audacity of his words made me sick. In the corner of the kitchen, my mother held a tiny bowl containing nothing but cold, instant microwave rice. She had no side dishes. All the premium beef had been aggressively hoarded onto Kevin and Michelle's plates. My mother was visibly thinner than she had been 3 weeks ago, with deep, dark circles carved under her eyes. "Is this what people who are taking care of someone do? It's late today. So why don't you go book a room at a motel downtown?" Michelle stated coldly, staring right at my face. "Sarah told us she's leaving everything regarding this house to us. You rarely come home anyway, so you're basically an outsider, right?" Michelle smiled triumphantly and reached her fork back into the pot for more meat. "That's right. Don't go pulling any stunts. As representatives of the family, we have a responsibility to protect Sarah in her old age." Kevin nodded in satisfaction, turning his attention back to the TV and letting out a loud, obnoxious laugh. They thought they had completely won. They believed that by hijacking this house, dominating my timid mother through fear, and kicking me the daughter out, they would secure this comfortable life and all our assets for themselves. In an ordinary situation, Hiding behind the word family might have prevented the police from intervening, dismissing it as a civil dispute, and I might have been forced to retreat. In fact, my mother was standing there, utterly crushed by their pressure, unable to even ask me for help. I slowly stepped into the living room. "Hey, didn't you hear me? I told you to get out." Michelle raised her voice in annoyance and started to stand up. Ignoring them completely, I walked straight to my mother in the kitchen. With every step I took, I could see her small body trembling. "Mom!" I called out in the gentlest voice I could manage. Unable to hold it back any longer, heavy tears spilled from my mother's eyes. "I am so sorry, Maya. You built this precious house for me, and I couldn't even protect it." Her voice was hoarse and broken. Even while having her food restricted and being forced to stand on a freezing floor, she did not care about her own suffering. She was only weeping out of deep guilt, believing she had trampled on my love for her. I could painfully feel the sheer terror and sorrow this woman who had lived her entire life trying never to be a burden to anyone had endured over the last 3 weeks. I wrapped both of my hands firmly around her trembling, freezing ones. They were as cold as ice. "It is okay, Mom. You do not have to apologize for anything." I purposely spoke in a clear, carrying voice, so Kevin and Michelle would hear every word. "Just wait a little bit. I am going to end all of this right now." I pulled my smartphone from my coat pocket and dialed a number I already had ready on the screen. It rang only once. The person on the other end had been on standby, waiting precisely for the time of my arrival. "Yes, it is me. I just arrived," I said in a quiet, unwavering voice. "Yes, everything is going exactly according to plan. Please come in immediately." After a brief 10-second call, I placed my phone on the table. Kevin snorted. "What? Did you just book your motel? Smart choice. We will ship whatever junk is in your room to you tomorrow. Cash on delivery." Michelle looked at me with equal mockery. "If you had just been obedient and left from the start, we wouldn't have had to feel bad. We are family, after all." They had not noticed a thing. They had no idea how fatally they had miscalculated. They had no clue why I was standing there, showing no signs of panic, seemingly accepting the situation in silence. At that moment, they had no way of knowing that I had discovered all their lies and crimes while I was on my business trip 3 weeks ago, and that I had been making flawless preparations behind the scenes. They were utterly ignorant of the absolute, decisive legal fact that this house, which they thought they could steal simply because they were family, would never belong to them. Right then, the front doorbell rang out heavily, tearing through the silence of the night. Once, twice, 3 times. It was a long, forceful sound, not the ring of a neighbor or a delivery driver, but the announcement of a very serious visitor. Kevin's smug smile vanished. The piece of meat Michelle was about to drop into the pot slipped from her fork. Keeping my mother's hand gently in mine, I began to walk slowly toward the front door. The sound of their brief, pathetic illusion of grandeur coming to an absolute end was right outside. The doorbell rang again, louder this time. The harsh electronic chime vibrated through the air of the chili-scented living room. "Hey, don't open it," Kevin's agitated voice called out from behind me. "It's probably one of those door-to-door scams. Just pretend we aren't home." Michelle stood up nervously and clung to Kevin's arm. To people who had hijacked someone else's home and were secretly draining her bank accounts, a sudden visitor was a terrifying prospect. I slowly turned around. I saw Kevin grab the empty beer bottle from the table as if to threaten me. Yet, I did not take a single step back. My eyes were not on Kevin's face, but on my mother's small back behind him. My mother's hands had always been terribly rough. When I was in middle school, my father suddenly passed away from an illness. From that day on, my mother worked from morning until night. She cleaned office buildings in the early mornings, worked the cash register at a supermarket during the day, and did piecework assembly at home late into the night, all to earn my tuition and living expenses by herself. In the winter, her fingertips would crack and bleed, always wrapped in bandages. Yet, she never once complained. "As long as you are smiling, Maya, that is all the happiness I need." That was her favorite thing to say while stroking my hair with those rough hands. I loved those hands more than anything in the world. When I married at 24, my mother rejoiced as if it were her own happiness. But that joy did not last long. When I was in my mid-30s, my husband was killed in a car accident. The sudden loss destroyed me. I stopped eating and spent every day crying in a dark room. It was my mother who saved me then. She drove 2 hours round trip every single day from her drafty, old apartment to my house. She never told me to cheer up or to try harder. She simply made me warm soup and rubbed my back as I cried myself to sleep. The warmth from her hands slowly melted my frozen heart. I was only able to overcome my grief and start my own architectural firm because of her. That was why I swore an oath. I would protect the rest of my mother's life at all costs. I designed this house solely as a way to repay her. I lowered the kitchen counters by 2 inches to accommodate her height. I chose soft, shock-absorbing wood for the flooring to protect her joints. I installed radiant floor heating throughout the entire house so her feet would never be cold in the winter. And in the backyard, past the porch, I planted a cherry tree, her favorite. It was meant to be a place where she could spend the rest of her life smiling, truly at peace, without having to defer to anyone. This was the sanctuary I had spent 10 years building. And yet, look at the living room now. The soft wood floors were mercilessly gouged by Michelle's high heels. The kitchen, designed specifically for my mother's ease, was overflowing with empty beer cans and garbage bags. My mother was not even allowed to stand in her own kitchen, banished to a freezing corner. The sight alone was enough to rip my heart to shreds. I first noticed this abnormal situation 3 weeks ago. On the night before I departed for Europe, I called my mother from the airport terminal. "Mom, I am leaving the country for 3 weeks starting tomorrow," but the usual cheerful voice telling me to be safe was missing. Instead, I only heard the faint sound of a television in the background. "Mom, what is wrong?" After a few seconds of silence, she replied in a terribly small voice. "Oh, be safe. Do your best at work." Her voice was trembling. Then, from deep in the background, I heard an unfamiliar, low voice. "Hey, we are out of booze. Go buy some right now." It was unmistakably a man yelling. I could not believe my ears. My mother lived alone. There was no reason for a man to be in her house at 8 o'clock at night. "Is someone there right now?" "I just heard a man's voice." I pressed her. She gasped in panic. "No, it is just the TV. I was watching a movie." Whenever my mother lied, she spoke faster than usual, and she always let out a tiny sigh at the end of her sentences. She let out that exact sigh. I did not push her any further, but a cold sense of dread spread through my chest. Right before boarding my flight, I opened my banking app to check the transaction history of the account I used to manage my mother's living expenses. The moment I saw the screen, the blood drained from my body. Over the past 3 days, someone had withdrawn $500, the absolute daily maximum limit, 3 times in a row. My mother was incredibly frugal. She only used a few $100s a month. There was absolutely no way she would withdraw that much cash in such a short time. Furthermore, all the withdrawals were made past 9 o'clock at night. My mother, who had bad knees, would never walk to a convenience store ATM at that hour. Someone had taken her debit card and PIN and was forcing these withdrawals. I was absolutely certain my mother had been targeted by malicious parasites. I immediately opened the airline app to cancel my trip and fly back home. But my finger hovered over the screen. I realized that bursting in emotionally would not solve the problem. If I confronted the perpetrators, my timid mother would undoubtedly say, "I told them it was okay. We are family. We help each other." She feared family disputes more than anything. She genuinely believed that if she just endured the pain, everything would resolve peacefully. Furthermore, American police routinely treat financial disputes between family members as civil matters and refuse to intervene. A half-baked counterattack would only result in malicious retaliation against my mother the moment I turned my back. I needed solid, undeniable evidence and a flawless setup to legally and completely eliminate them. I needed a trap with no escape routes to ensure they could never come near this house again. The 3 weeks on my business trip were a living hell. During the day, I smiled and attended meetings with European clients. But every night, from my hotel room, I constantly communicated with an American private investigation firm and a real estate attorney. I monitored the movements in my mother's bank account and had the investigators dig up every piece of information on Kevin and Michelle's identities and current situation. I wanted to fly home immediately and save her. Every night in bed, I desperately fought back tears and a boiling, violent rage. "Hey, I told you not to do anything stupid," Kevin yelled, stomping out of the living room and into the hallway, tightly gripping the empty beer bottle. I turned my head and shot him a single, freezing glare. "Do not take another step." Pressed down by the absolute zero pressure of my voice, Kevin's feet stopped dead in their tracks. The man who mistakenly believed he was the master of the house retreated at a single sentence. I could see the hand holding the bottle shaking slightly. I turned forward again and placed my hand on the front doorknob. The cold metal solidified my resolve. During my trip, the lawyer had obtained a single piece of evidence. I was certain it would be the ultimate weapon to end them. Without hesitation, I slowly opened the heavy front door. The cold night air rushed into the foyer, washing away the greasy chili smell leaking from the living room. The person standing there was not a police officer, nor was it a lawyer. It was an older man in a plain, dark, gray suit. He held a thick manila envelope in his hands. However, the moment Kevin saw this man's face, the blood instantly drained from his cheeks. "You." Kevin's voice trembled faintly. The man ignored Kevin entirely and nodded respectfully to me. "Miss Davis, I have brought the items you requested." This man was Carter, the private investigator I had hired. He was a former police officer and a specialist in debt collection and missing persons cases. In fact, during a time when Kevin was on the run from loan sharks, it was Carter who had relentlessly tracked him down on behalf of the creditors. To Kevin, Carter was the last person on earth he ever wanted to see. "Everything is in here. Their movements leading up to them fleeing into this house, the security camera footage from the ATMs, everything," Carter said in a quiet voice, handing me the envelope. The envelope was heavy, transferring its cold weight to my hands. This weight was the exact measure of the terror my mother had endured for 3 weeks. Kevin backed away, shrinking behind Michelle's back. The aggressive man who had been threatening me with a glass bottle moments ago was completely gone. Looking at the envelope in my hands, I closed my eyes quietly. The memories of the night I hired Carter and began preparing my counterattack, the night I secured all my convictions 3 weeks ago, vividly resurfaced in my mind. On the first day of my business trip, sitting alone on the bed of a foreign hotel, my eyes were glued to my banking app. $500 withdrawn, 3 days in a row. I knew my mother's spending habits better than anyone. She was someone who kept the leather wallet I bought her for over 10 years because it was a waste to throw it away. She only withdrew cash once a month, exactly $300 on the day her Social Security check arrived. She would neatly fold the ATM receipts and store them in an empty cookie tin. For her to withdraw cash late at night, 3 days in a row, was something that would not happen even if the sky fell. The low voice of a man over the phone, my mother's trembling voice, and the unnatural withdrawals. The worst possible scenarios expanded in my chest. Was she being held hostage by a robber? Was she being extorted by a fraud ring? I debated calling the local police immediately. But if I was wrong, and my mother was actually willingly hosting relatives, having the police kick down the door would deeply shame and humiliate her. More importantly, if the perpetrators were violent, a premature police visit could put her life in direct danger. I needed concrete proof. I had activated a call recording app on my phone and dialed the landline at my mother's house instead of her cell phone. The landline was in the living room. If someone was monitoring her, they would undoubtedly be there. The cold, drawn-out international ringtone echoed. Once, twice, 3 times. Normally, my mother answered before the 3rd ring. But that night, it rang 5, 6 times. Just as the 7th ring began, the receiver was picked up. "Hello?" It was my mother's voice. But it was not her usual bright tone. It was a hushed, hoarse whisper, as if she were holding her breath. I tightened my core so my voice wouldn't shake and spoke in my normal tone. "Mom, sorry it's so late. I made it to the hotel safely." "Oh, good. I am relieved." Her response was unnatural, like she was reading from a script. "I was just about to go to sleep." With that single sentence, I knew with absolute certainty she was lying. My mother watched the local 10 o'clock news every single night before bed. It was only 9:30 in her time zone. My meticulous mother would never sleep without watching the news. I threw out a probing question. "Mom, did you withdraw money from the bank? Did you suddenly need cash for something?" I heard a sharp intake of breath over the phone. The audio waveform on my recording app perfectly captured her faint panic. "Ah, yes, just a little. I thought I would buy some new bedding." Her excuse was clearly falling apart. Buying new bedding was a painfully transparent lie. Just last month, I had gifted her a premium down comforter. She cherished it, airing it out carefully and saying it was too nice to use. There was no way she would suddenly go buy new bedding with cash. That was when it happened. From deep in the background, a faint but sharp woman's voice cut through. "Stop saying unnecessary things. Hurry up and hang up the phone." It was unmistakably Michelle's voice. My mother panicked and spoke over my voice. "Sorry. The TV drama is just so loud, and you have an early morning tomorrow, right? I am hanging up now." "Mom, wait, before I could finish." The call was ruthlessly disconnected. The lifeless electronic beep echoed endlessly in my hotel room. I pulled the phone away from my ear and slumped onto the edge of the bed. My hands were shaking violently. It was not out of fear. It was a cold, violent tremor of sheer rage at the fact that my mother was being screamed at by a strange woman in her own home, not even allowed to speak freely on the phone. I played back the recorded audio. I put on my earphones, turned the volume to maximum, and listened to it over and over, the sharp voice of the woman telling her to hang up. My mother's frightened, hoarse voice as she desperately lied to keep me from worrying. She was enduring this terror entirely alone, just so she would not be a burden to me. Knowing I was far away overseas, she had probably given up on even asking for help. Tears streamed down my cheeks. I was so frustrated and disgusted with myself. The house I built to protect my mother had become a prison torturing her. That reality sliced through my heart like a blade. But I stopped crying. I violently wiped my tears with the back of my hand and took a deep breath. These were people who used verbal violence to dominate an elderly woman and steal her money without batting an eye. Confronting them emotionally would solve nothing. I had to use the cold, ruthless weapon of the law to crush them so thoroughly they could never stand back up. I made my decision right then. I opened my laptop and spent the entire night utilizing the time difference to contact top-tier investigation firms and real estate attorneys back in the States. What drove me that night was my profound love for my mother, and an emotion bordering on a quiet, murderous intent toward the parasites who had invaded her home. My consciousness snapped back from the foreign hotel 3 weeks ago to the present living room. In front of me was the heavy envelope from Carter, and beyond it stood Kevin and Michelle, completely drained of color. The investigator's report details both of your magnificent histories perfectly, I said quietly. Kevin let out a short, wheezing sound from the back of his throat. Running from debt collectors, running out of places to go, and targeting a timid, elderly relative. You invite yourselves in saying it'll just be for a few days, and once you realize she won't fight back, you act like you own the place. What a brilliant plan. Michelle, her face pale blue, shook her head frantically. No, we really intended to take care of Sarah. We were just taking care of her. I laughed coldly. Draining $500 a day, eating premium steaks while forcing my mother to eat cold rice, is that what you call taking care of someone? Michelle lost her words and dropped her gaze to the floor. I gave a slight nod to Carter. Without a word, Carter pushed the front door wide open. Waiting outside in the cold night was the true onslaught I had prepared to finalize my resolve. At this point, the two of them still didn't realize that the trap I had set was not just a private investigator's report. They hadn't yet realized that this very house was functioning as a legal locked room designed to corner them completely. Carter cast a sharp glance outside the open door, like a hound making sure the net was secure around its prey. He turned to me and nodded deeply. Miss Davis, Foster, the attorney, and the local police precinct have been briefed on the situation. At the low resonance of Carter's voice, Kevin's face twisted in horror. They are currently on standby around the perimeter of the property. They are ready to move in the moment I give the signal, Carter said, popping the collar of his gray coat. Until then, I will secure the exterior. Rest assured, they will not take a single step off this property. With those final words, Carter quietly shut the heavy front door. The mechanical click of the deadbolt echoed through the freezing hallway. The house was once again left with just 4 people. Myself, my mother, Kevin, and Michelle. But the atmosphere had entirely changed. This house was now a legal isolation chamber from which they could not escape. Outside the window, the cold night wind rustled the branches of the cherry tree. An overwhelming silence dominated the living room, which still reeked of cheap chili. After a few seconds of suffocating silence, Kevin let out a forced, booming laugh. Ha ha ha. You're just trying to scare us. It's just a bluff by a rent-a-cop PI, Kevin shouted, as if trying to convince himself, violently crushing the empty beer can on the table. The sickening sound of twisting metal rang out, making my mother in the corner flinch. Hey Michelle, don't be scared. There's no way the cops are waiting outside. It's a bluff. Kevin's eyes were bloodshot as he glared at me, trying to intimidate me. The cops aren't going to make a huge fuss over a family squabble. Haven't you ever heard that it's a civil matter? We're family. Michelle forced a twisted smile onto her pale face. Right. We haven't done anything wrong. Sarah told us we could stay. They were desperately trying to interpret reality in a way that benefited them. Admitting their own crimes was simply too terrifying for them. It was the wretched self-defense mechanism, typical of people who exploit the goodwill of others and only know how to extort the weak. I completely ignored their pathetic excuses. I quietly broke the seal on the envelope I received from Carter. I had no letter opener. The small sound of my fingernails slowly tearing through the thick paper began to silence their babbling. Inside was a thick report, several color photographs, and a small black USB flash drive. I pulled out a single photograph. Kevin, Michelle, have you already forgotten the day you barged into this house? I slowly slid the photo across the table toward them. It was a picture of the front of the house, taken at night 2 weeks ago. Carter had begun surveillance the moment I hired him, capturing this with a night vision camera. The photo clearly showed the two of them standing before the front door with large, battered suitcases. I heard about what you said to my mother that day. I read directly from the report. Our business failed. We're being chased by debt collectors, and we got evicted. We have nowhere to go. Please just let us stay for 3 days. I heard my mother gasp softly behind me. She had believed they were truly in trouble. Out of pity, she had let them in. Kevin reached out to snatch the photo, but I swiftly pulled it back. But there's something strange. I noticed a small discrepancy the moment I walked in today. I pointed to the hallway behind them. My mother's shoes are always placed neatly in the corner of the foyer. But today, your shoes were thrown right in the middle of the entryway like you owned the place. That wasn't just bad manners. It was a manifestation of the arrogance that made you think this house belonged to you. I continued. And that's not all. My late father's silver pocket watch, which sat on the entryway console table, is gone. Michelle flinched violently. That watch was something my father bought with his very first bonus. Even after it broke and stopped ticking, my mother polished it with a cloth every single day. When my mother heard my words, she covered her mouth in shock. She hadn't even realized the watch was missing, or perhaps she had convinced herself she misplaced it. And the drawer of the console table has fresh gouge marks, as if someone tried to pry it open with a flathead screwdriver. Kevin's face changed color. My mother would never leave such violent marks. You begged in tears to stay for just 3 days. But from the very beginning, you were scavenging this house for valuables. Am I wrong? At my quiet question, Kevin clicked his tongue aggressively. Don't be ridiculous. Sarah gave us that watch, told us to use it for living expenses. It was an ugly, utterly stupid lie. There was no way my mother would give my father's most precious keepsake to strangers she hadn't seen in decades. Is that so? She gave it to you? I said coldly, pulling another document from the envelope. It was a copy of a purchase receipt Carter had tracked down by visiting every pawn shop in town. On it, Michelle's name and signature were clearly written in the seller's section. So you took a precious gift and pawned it downtown on the exact same day. You work fast. When I placed the paper on the table, Michelle's face turned dark red with anger and humiliation. The purchase price listed was a mere $30. The precious memories of my parents had been turned into $30 of drinking money by their hands. I could hear my mother sobbing quietly behind me, likely blaming herself again for failing to protect the keepsake. I felt an overwhelming urge to throw the boiling pot of chili directly at these two, but I clenched my fists tightly and forced the rage down into the pit of my stomach. If I got emotional here, I would be stepping down to their level. Cornered with undeniable evidence, something snapped inside Michelle. Don't act so high and mighty just because you have a little money. She suddenly stood up and slammed her hands on the table, hurling a vicious insult at me. Her words ruthlessly gouged at the deepest, most painful wound of my past, one I never wanted touched. It's because you're a cold-hearted bitch like this that your husband died and you were never blessed with kids. Michelle's shrill voice echoed through the room. The moment those words dropped, the air in the room froze solid. I gripped the thick envelope until my knuckles turned stark white. The sickening sound of the heavy paper crumpling echoed loudly in my ears. The smiling face of my gentle husband who passed away 10 years ago. The peaceful Sunday afternoons where we laughed and talked about having children someday. Before those dreams could come true, he was taken from me. Losing him before we could start a family was the deepest, most incurable sorrow of my life. I didn't know how many oceans of tears I had cried before I could stand again. Only my mother knew the depths of that despair and stood by my side. Michelle had mercilessly stomped all over the scars I had fought so hard to close. Kevin let out a vulgar laugh, agreeing with his wife. She's exactly right. No kids, no husband. Just a woman obsessed with her career and money. That's why the only thing you could build was this cold, empty house. He pounded the table, mocking me. The bright, artificial laughter from the reality TV show made the abnormality of this space even more grotesque. I felt the blood boil in every vein of my body. I wanted to scream, I wanted to hurl the pot right at their despicable faces, but I bit my lip hard and endured it. If I raised my voice here, I would be dragged into their low-level brawl. Besides, the stage to cast them into absolute despair was not yet fully set. I just stared back at them in total silence. Then it happened. "Stop it." A hoarse, yet crystal-clear voice rang out. When I turned around, my mother, who had been trembling in the corner of the kitchen, was slowly standing up. Because she had been forced to stand on the cold floor for so long, her legs were shaking faintly. Even so, she braced herself against the wall, desperately supporting her weight. Her eyes, usually so gentle and crinkled with warmth, were now piercing straight through Michelle. They harbored a quiet, burning fury against unreasonable violence. "I will tolerate you mocking me. I am pathetic, so I will endure that." My mother took one step, then another, walking straight toward the two of them. "But I will absolutely never forgive you for hurting my daughter." It was a powerful tone I had never heard from her before. My mother, who always deferred to others and swallowed her own opinions. My mother, who had spent 3 weeks paralyzed by Kevin's threats. That same mother was squeezing out every last ounce of her strength to stand up, solely to protect me. "What the hell, old lady? Getting a big head all of a sudden?" Kevin clicked his tongue in annoyance. "Because you wouldn't just hand over your bank card and PIN, I had to walk all the way to the ATM every night for you. You're an ungrateful parent and daughter, biting the hand that takes care of you." Kevin pulled a familiar blue booklet from his breast pocket and flaunted it. It was the bank register for the account I set up for my mother's expenses. It had a cute floral design on the cover that we had picked out together at the bank. His thick, greasy fingers were gripping it roughly. "I withdrew $5,000 over the last 3 weeks. Consider it a legitimate caregiver fee for your family." Kevin slapped the book against the table and laughed triumphantly. "If you have a problem with it, go to the cops or wherever you want. The police don't give a damn about financial disputes between family members. I know the law." Kevin, having spent his life running from debt collectors, possessed that specific brand of shallow, street-level legal knowledge. He knew the police often refused to intervene in familial thefts, calling them civil matters. That was exactly why he had been able to aggressively threaten my mother and steal her money. I stepped in front of my mother. I pulled her trembling shoulders into an embrace and gently rubbed her back. Her body was still shaking in small bursts. "It is okay, Mom. Thank you," I whispered to her, then turned my icy gaze back to Kevin. I pulled the final piece of evidence from the envelope. It was the small black USB flash drive. I placed it quietly on the table with a soft clack, right next to the rings of condensation left by the beer. "What the hell is that?" Kevin stared at the flash drive suspiciously. "You truly believe the police won't intervene because this is a family dispute, don't you?" I said, my voice completely devoid of emotion, like solid ice. "It's true that police sometimes brush things off as civil matters among family." I delivered the knowledge my lawyer had drilled into me with ruthless precision. "But that only works if you actually have legal residency here. And you don't, because this house does not belong to my mother." Wah, a dumbfounded sound leaked from Kevin's mouth. Michelle looked equally confused, unable to comprehend what I was saying. They had fully believed that this impressive single-family home belonged to my elderly, solitary mother. That was exactly why they thought they could freely hijack it just by silencing her. "The house you barged into has belonged entirely to me from the very beginning." I delivered the decisive, fatal blow. "You are not taking care of a relative in her home. You are simply criminals who have trespassed into a complete stranger's house, extorting and stealing money from an elderly woman." The moment those words echoed through the living room, the atmosphere completely shattered. It sounded as if the floor they were standing on had collapsed beneath their feet. I could see Kevin's face turning a ghastly shade of pale from sheer terror. And then, behind me, the sound of the heavy front door opening echoed again. The true visitors who had been waiting outside were finally stepping into this locked room. The sound of quiet, orderly leather shoes walking down the hallway approached. The living room door slowly opened, revealing an older man impeccably dressed in a dark suit. This was Mr. Foster, the attorney I had hired from overseas. Foster was a highly capable legal expert, specializing in real estate disputes and elder financial abuse. Forgive the late intrusion. I represent Miss Davis as her legal counsel. "My name is Foster," he said quietly, placing his business card on the grease-stained wood table. Kevin made no move to take the card. "L lawyer? Who calls a lawyer? You're blowing a simple family discussion way out of proportion," Kevin shouted aggressively. but his voice was audibly cracking. For a man who spent his life running from debt, the words lawyer and law were just as terrifying as the police. Foster quietly placed the card at the edge of the table and pulled a thick file from his briefcase. This is not a family discussion. This is a clear case of trespassing, elder abuse, and theft. Foster's cold, calculating voice rang out in the chili-scented room. Thanks to the investigator, we already have absolute proof of your unlawful occupation and the fraudulent use of the bank accounts. I must ask you to vacate the premises immediately. Kevin and Michelle looked at each other, unable to hide their panic. But Kevin quickly put up a front and fired back. Theft? Don't make us sound like criminals. Sarah gave us the PIN number herself. That's right. We were just doing her a favor and withdrawing money for her because she has bad knees. Michelle chimed in desperately, clinging to Kevin's lie. I took my hands out of my pockets and spoke quietly. Kevin, this evening at the convenience store ATM, you tried to withdraw money again, didn't you? Kevin's face twitched violently. How did you? It gave you an error and spit the card back out, didn't it? I observed Kevin's panic with a cold gaze. During my business trip, I had contacted the bank's fraud department. I informed them of the suspicious, consecutive withdrawals and told them my elderly mother's card had likely been stolen by individuals claiming to be relatives. By explaining the situation and providing my pre-existing authorization as her registered power of attorney, the bank agreed there was a high suspicion of fraud. On the condition that a police report was filed, they temporarily froze the account completely. This was the first step of my silent counterattack. I had entirely severed their lifeline, my mother's savings. Are you kidding me? If we can't withdraw that money, we don't have living expenses for tomorrow. Kevin turned bright red and slammed his fist on the table. If you need living expenses, go get a job and earn it yourself. I fired back without yielding an inch. Aren't you embarrassed to be in your 50s and acting like a parasite on someone else's savings and Social Security? How dare you take the precious money my mother saved by cleaning floors through the pain in her knees and turn it into meat for your stew? Kevin bit his lip hard in frustration, but the next moment, his expression twisted bizarrely. A creepy, thin smile spread across his red, angry face. I see. So you got a lawyer and froze the accounts. You're a pretty smart daughter. Kevin slowly reached into the inside pocket of his jacket. But I'm not an idiot either. I prepared a legal weapon of my own for a time exactly like this. Kevin pulled out a piece of paper, folded in four, and spread it out on the condensation-stained table. The moment she saw that paper, my mother let out a small shriek from behind me. Mom? I looked back to see her covering her face with both hands, shaking violently. I am so sorry, Maya. I signed it. At her desperate voice, I looked down at the paper on the table. It was a standard, store-bought lease agreement form, filled out with messy handwriting. The landlord was listed as Sarah, and the tenant as Kevin. Next to my mother's name was her unmistakable signature. We aren't squatters. We signed a formal rental agreement with Sarah, the owner of this house. Kevin tapped the contract triumphantly with his thick finger. Rent is $100 a month. The term is 10 years. With her signature on it, this is a perfectly valid legal document. I moved close to my mother and wrapped my arm around her shoulder. Mom, why did you sign something like this? Crying and trembling, she revealed the truth she had been hiding. They told me that if I didn't sign it, they would go to your architecture firm and destroy it. They said they would cause a massive scene in front of your clients. My heart froze solid. My mother knew better than anyone how hard I had worked to get my license and start my own firm. She knew the days I drew blueprints until dawn, unable to eat from the pressure. It was my mother who rubbed my back and brought me warm tea every night. To her, my firm was the crystallization of my life. It was my life itself. They had aimed a despicable blade directly at her deep love for me. Exactly. Sarah rented this house to us of her own free will. Kevin smirked vulgarly, looking at Foster as if to provoke him. Mr. Lawyer, you know about tenant rights, right? Once you rent a house out, it's not so easy to evict the tenants, no matter how much the daughter screams. Michelle regained her confidence and crossed her arms. That's right. This is practically our house now. We're even giving Sarah $100 directly into her wallet every month for rent. If anything, we'll call the cops on you for trespassing. They were absolutely certain that with this single piece of paper, the law would act as their impenetrable shield. They had no doubt that the signature they extorted from my mother was an absolute deed that would protect them forever. However, Kevin had made one irreversible, fatal oversight. The contract he was gripping was nothing more than a meaningless scrap of paper. I met Foster's eyes and we exchanged a quiet glance. The moment their shallow lies would completely collapse was finally upon them. As long as this signature is here, the law protects us. Kevin's mouth curled up like a distorted crescent moon. He held up the lease agreement as if it were a royal decree. Michelle clung to his arm, wearing a wicked smirk. Yep. Sarah agreed to it and signed it herself. Her sharp gaze shot toward my mother, who was trembling in my arms. My mother had handed over her signature to protect my firm. That fact squeezed my chest violently. Kevin and Michelle had meticulously plotted their takeover of this house. Having lost their own home to debt and been abandoned by all their relatives, they set their sights on a timid, elderly widow whose daughter lived far away. We've had it hard too. You know, Kevin suddenly started talking like a victim. Someone like you, who has a fancy job and money, wouldn't understand. We lost our business and had nowhere to live. It's only right that family shares their wealth. The sheer absurdity of sharing wealth because we're family made me dizzy. I built this house by working myself to the bone, saving money over 10 years. The hardship they spoke of was entirely their own doing, debts born from gambling and vanity. Carter's report detailed Kevin's gambling addiction and Michelle's obsession with buying designer goods. They destroyed themselves with their own greed. Yet, they were trying to steal the peaceful retirement of my hardworking mother, as if it were their given right. This house is huge. It's great. The heating is amazing. And the kitchen is so easy to use, Michelle said. Looking around the kitchen she had no part in designing, sounding incredibly satisfied. We've decided to live here for the rest of our lives. We'll take care of Sarah for the $100 in rent, so you can just relax and do your work overseas, Maya. Their greed was bottomless. Using the excuse of $100 in rent, they planned to siphon $5,000 at a time, pushing my mother into the corner with cold rice while they ate premium steaks that was their version of taking care. Kevin even had the audacity to hold his hand out toward me. Well, we aren't volunteers either. You should probably wire us $1,000 a month for Sarah's caregiving fees. Not only had they hijacked a stranger's house, but they were trying to extort me further. I moved past anger straight into sheer disbelief at their boundless depravity. Maya, I am so sorry. My mother kept apologizing in a fading voice from my arms. When I thought about your firm getting in trouble, my mind went blank, and I just signed whatever they told me to. I slowly rubbed my mother's back. Mom, I told you not to apologize anymore, I said in a deliberately calm voice to reassure her. You did nothing wrong. You were trying to protect my work. Thank you. Tears overflowed from her eyes again. Seeing her cry turned the anger inside me toward Kevin and Michelle into absolute zero-degree ice. I would not allow them to contaminate another second of her life. All right, is the touching family drama over? Kevin tapped his finger impatiently on the table. Mr. Lawyer, you can't lay a hand on us if we have a contract. Go home. Or should I call the cops on you for trespassing? Kevin fully believed he was the victor of this game, armed with the ultimate shield of the law. But Foster did not rise to the provocation. He simply let out a quiet sigh. It wasn't a sigh of anger, but one containing deep pity for Kevin's utter ignorance. Kevin, may I take a brief look at that contract? Foster calmly held out his hand. Kevin guarded the contract against his chest, suspiciously. Just looking. If you rip it, I'll sue you for property damage. Kevin spread the contract back out in the middle of the table, pressing down firmly on the edges so it couldn't be snatched away. Foster pulled a pair of silver reading glasses from his breast pocket and slowly put them on. He leaned forward and began to read the handwritten text. The only sound in the living room was the hollow laughter from the reality TV show. Kevin crossed his arms proudly, and Michelle looked at Foster with a triumphant face, waiting for the lawyer to throw in the towel and admit it was a flawless contract. After several dozen seconds of silence, Foster slowly looked up. I see. You filled out a standard, store-bought residential lease template yourself. Foster's voice was shockingly flat. The landlord is the mother, Sarah. The tenant is Kevin. The signature is genuine and clearly dated. Yes, on its face, the formatting is correct. See? Kevin snorted vulgarly. I used to hang around a real estate office back in the day. I know how these procedures work. We are protected by tenant rights. As Kevin bragged, Foster took off his glasses and dropped a ruthless truth. However, Kevin, legally speaking, this contract is entirely void. The sound of Kevin snorting stopped dead. What the hell are you talking about? The smug smile vanished from his face. Her signature is on it. There's no way it's void. Michelle frantically pointed at the paper too. Yeah, Sarah brought the pen and signed it herself. We didn't force her. They were basically confessing to coercion, but they were too panicked to even realize it. Foster coldly cut down Kevin's words. Whether the signature is genuine or not is irrelevant. The problem is that the fundamental premise of this contract is fundamentally flawed. Foster opened his file. Kevin, you said you were familiar with real estate, did you not? Foster's eyes pierced right through Kevin. Then you must know the most basic law of all. You cannot rent out property that does not belong to you. Unable to process the meaning of those words immediately, Kevin froze with his mouth half open. Michelle blinked in confusion. They still hadn't realized their fatal mistake. They had believed this house belonged to my elderly, solitary mother, and were overjoyed at securing a meaningless contract. Foster, let's stop keeping them in suspense, I said quietly. Please show them true despair. Foster nodded deeply and pulled a single official document from his file. The moment their shallow lies would shatter completely was finally here. Foster placed the paper quietly on the table. It was an official, freshly issued property deed from the county records office, stamped with a bright state seal to prevent forgery. Kevin, look closely. Foster's finger pointed to the ownership section of the document. The owner of this land and structure is Maya Davis. In other words, the daughter standing right in front of you. The blood drained from Kevin's face in an instant. Looking like he couldn't believe his eyes, he snatched the document with his grease-stained hands. Owner, Maya Davis. You're lying. This isn't Sarah's house? This house is legally titled in Maya's name, built entirely with her own funds. Foster stated the cold, hard facts. Her mother merely has a life estate granting her permission to reside here while she is alive. But by law, she is strictly prohibited from transferring, selling, or leasing this property to anyone else. The homemade lease agreement Kevin was clutching like a lifeline had instantly transformed into a worthless scrap of trash. Meaning, the contract you signed with her is entirely void, as you signed it with someone who possessed zero legal authority to lease the house, Foster concluded. Michelle let out a sound somewhere between a gasp and a scream. No way. Then what happens to us? She panicked, shaking Kevin's arm violently. You are nothing but squatters trespassing in a complete stranger's home with zero legal rights, I stated coldly. The two of them looked at each other in absolute despair. It's over, I thought. But I was still underestimating the depths of human malice when pushed into a corner. Ha ha ha! Kevin suddenly started shaking with laughter. It wasn't a bluff to hide his fear. It was the sickeningly vile laugh of a villain who remembered his final trump card and found a glimmer of hope. The loud TV in the background made his madness stand out even more. I see. The house didn't belong to the old lady. I lose. We'll leave. Kevin reached into his pocket again. But like I said, I'm not an idiot. The moment the old lady handed over her signature so easily, I figured there might be a catch. Kevin pulled out a piece of copy paper, folded in 4, and slammed it down in front of Foster. If I can't take the house, I'll just squeeze cash out of you another way. Look at this. The moment I saw the document, my heart froze, and even the always calm Foster's eyebrow twitched slightly. It was a promissory note. The amount written clearly on it was $100,000. The lender was a shady, unfamiliar payday loan company. The borrower was Kevin. The problem was the section below it. The co-signer. There, my mother's name and address were written, alongside the exact same signature that was on the lease agreement. Mom, what is this? I asked, my voice trembling. My mother stared at it like she was looking at an alien object. No! I never signed anything like that, she cried out, shaking her head violently. I only signed the paper they said was for the house. Kevin looked down at her with a wicked smirk. Did you go senile, old lady? You signed it yourself. He looked at me triumphantly. When we did the lease agreement, I told her there were other municipal documents she needed to sign. I slipped this promissory note into the stack and had her sign it blank. It was a trap. Taking advantage of my mother's failing eyesight, they had coerced her into signing multiple documents. I used this $100,000 to pay off my debts, Kevin said, downing the rest of his beer. Now, we are leaving this house. I have no job. Obviously, I can't pay back this $100,000. Kevin's eyes gleamed coldly like a snake, which means the loan sharks are going to come after the co-signer Sarah to collect. And let me tell you, their collection methods are brutal. They'll be banging on the door morning, noon, and night. My mother let out a short scream and collapsed to the floor. Michelle realized Kevin's trap and her wicked smile returned. Oh my, how terrible. If Sarah can't pay, those scary men might just have to go collect from Maya's fancy architecture firm. I'm sure your clients would love seeing thugs screaming about debts. Kevin brought his face close to mine. One move and your precious firm is ruined. If you don't want that, pay me $100,000 as a settlement. You do that, and I'll give you the original copy of this note. It was a devil's bargain. From the very beginning, as an insurance policy in case they couldn't secure the house, they had set my mother up as a guarantor for his massive underground debt. My mother covered her face with her hands, sobbing, I'm sorry. The despair of knowing her actions were going to destroy her daughter's life was completely breaking her spirit. I hugged my mother tightly as she crumbled to the floor. Her body was freezing. The firm I had built from the absolute bottom after losing my husband, the trust I had bled to establish, they were trying to burn it all to ash in an instant. My own body was trembling slightly, not out of fear, but from a murderous rage toward these parasites who would go to such sickening lengths to deceive an elderly woman. What's wrong, Maya? Where did all that confidence go? Kevin mocked, looking down at me. They believed they had completely won. They were certain this $100,000 promissory note made us entirely powerless. But they were making a massive mistake. I wasn't looking down in silence because I was in despair. I was simply taking a deep breath to convert my boiling rage into the power for a ruthless counterattack. I exchanged a split-second glance with Foster standing next to me. Foster wasn't shaken in the slightest. The look behind his cold glasses silently said, right on schedule. During my trip, Carter had reported that Kevin was secretly contacting a shady underground lender. I already knew everything. Kevin, I slowly raised my head and spoke in a voice as cold as ice. At the tone of my voice, Kevin's vulgar laughter stopped dead. He hadn't yet realized that the promissory note he thought was his ultimate weapon was actually the switch that would completely destroy him. He had expected me to turn pale and collapse in tears, because finding a family's weakness and extorting money was the only way a bottom feeder like him knew how to live. But there was not a single millimeter of despair on my face. What? Still trying to act tough? A faint look of panic crossed Kevin's face. I gently helped my mother up from the floor and sat her on the sofa. She was still trembling, but I grasped her hands firmly. Mom, it's okay. Just watch. At my strong words, she looked up in surprise and gave a small nod. I turned back to Kevin and looked down at the $100,000 promissory note spread across the table. The grease from the chili was starting to solidify in the cold air. Next to it lay this ugly piece of paper, a distillation of human greed. It really is true that arrogant people are boundlessly stupid, I said. Kevin's face flushed dark red with anger. Stupid? You want your firm to go under? Get the $100,000 ready right now, he bellowed, slamming his fist on the table. Michelle chimed in with her shrill voice. Yeah! You know what'll happen if you make us mad. They honestly believed that if they yelled loud enough, their opponent would submit. I took a quiet breath, recalling the memory from 3 weeks ago. The photograph Carter had sent to my hotel in Europe, it showed Kevin walking into a rundown building housing a shady payday lender. Carter's report stated, the subject is attempting to use fraudulently obtained signatures to take out an illegal loan. When I received that report, I wanted to fly back to America instantly. I cried in my hotel room countless times, worrying about my mother's safety. But Foster had firmly stopped me over the phone. Maya, if you burst in now, they will make excuses. They will tear up the papers and claim it's a minor family squabble, and the police won't be able to issue a definitive arrest warrant. American police hate intervening in family disputes. To ensure they can never come near your mother again, we have to let them commit an irreversible felony by their own hands. And we need them to do it right in front of legal witnesses. Do you know why I didn't come back until today? My quiet question made Kevin look confused. Because you were busy with work? He scoffed. No. I was waiting for the exact moment you shoved this forged promissory note in my face, I said. Kevin's eyes went wide. Foster took over, his voice ruthless. Kevin, coercing someone into signing a document under false pretenses is fraud. And just now, you attempted to use that forged document to extort $100,000 from Miss Davis. This is clear-cut attempted extortion, a severe felony. Extortion. At the heavy sound of the word, Michelle let out a small squeak and took a step back. What are you talking about? This is a real note. Sarah signed it herself. She tried desperately to make excuses, but her voice was shaking violently. Her previously arrogant demeanor had completely vanished. The police can decide if it's real or not, I stated coldly. Thanks to Carter's investigation, the exact time and date you entered that loan office is recorded. And, of course, that illegal lending company itself is already under police investigation. The blood drained from Kevin's face at a visible rate. Greasy sweat beaded on his forehead, and he began to tremble. He thought the promissory note was an invincible weapon, but in reality, it was the definitive piece of evidence that would drag him straight to hell. The reason I had remained silent for 3 weeks, enduring the agonizing pain in my chest, was solely to trap Kevin into presenting this evidence himself. Screw you. This is just a piece of paper. Panicking, Kevin grabbed the promissory note and tried to rip it to shreds. The sound of paper tearing echoed as he ripped it in half, thinking that destroying the evidence would let him escape. But Foster's cold voice stopped Kevin in his tracks. Tearing it up is pointless. That is merely a copy. Kevin completely froze. He stared at Foster with a dumbfounded expression, still clutching the torn pieces of paper. The original has already been recovered by Investigator Carter from the loan company, and it is currently in the hands of the police officers waiting outside, Foster said. Kevin's eyes widened in sheer disbelief. How the hell could a PI do that? He screamed like a madman. As a former police officer, Carter knew exactly how to squeeze illegal lenders. Terrified of a full-scale federal investigation, the loan sharks easily betrayed Kevin and handed the original promissory note straight to Carter. Kevin had been dancing in the center of an inescapable trap from the very beginning. You were trying to set me up from the start. Kevin pointed a trembling finger at Foster and me. We didn't set you up. You jumped into this hole yourself out of your own greed. I delivered my final ultimatum in an icy tone. You can't make excuses anymore. Today, you are going straight from this house to the police station. Michelle collapsed to her knees and started wailing. Kevin stared blankly at the chili pot, his mouth opening and closing like a fish. The time they thought they had won was pathetically short. But I still hadn't completely forgiven them. The deep scars they inflicted on my mother's heart couldn't be erased just by this. To put an end to this ordeal, I had to shove one final, decisive reality in their faces. From outside the front door, the sound of heavy footsteps finally approached. The real authorities who had been on standby were stepping into the living room. Sweat poured down Kevin's forehead. Michelle was curled up on the floor, holding her head and screaming that she didn't want to be arrested. Their shallow plan was completely ruined, and everyone assumed they just had to wait for the handcuffs. But human beings are capable of unbelievable things when backed into a corner. Ha ha ha. Kevin suddenly let out a loud, crazed laugh. It wasn't a bluff. It was the sickeningly eerie laugh of a villain who remembered his absolute last resort. Maya, you think you've won? Kevin stood up and blocked the doorway leading to the hall. If you bring the cops in, we might get arrested. But your life will be completely over, too. Kevin pulled his smartphone from his pocket. He tapped the screen to play a video and shoved it in front of me and Foster. The video showed my mother, sitting in the dim corner of the kitchen. A handwritten note was placed in front of her. In the video, my mother darted her eyes around in terror, reading the note in a trembling voice. Maya forced this cold house on me while she plays around overseas. I am so lonely and miserable every day. The only people who saved me were my cousins, Kevin and Michelle. I want to give this house and all my savings to them. It was a brutally painful video to watch. My mother's voice was thick with tears, and she choked on her words multiple times. Every time she did, Kevin's low, threatening voice could be heard faintly off camera. Keep reading. She had been threatened and forced to read this fabricated confession. I ground my back teeth together. The rage I had been suppressing was about to explode. Just imagining the terror my mother felt sitting in front of that camera made me want to strangle Kevin with my bare hands. Seeing my silent glare, Kevin's smile grew wider. How about that? A masterpiece, right? Sarah declaring she's giving her assets to us of her own free will. Kevin waved the phone with a vile smirk. You're a fancy architect, right? You sell family bonds and warm homes to your clients. What do you think will happen if this video gets uploaded to your company's website or sent to the local news and social media? A famous female architect who abuses her mother and sells out her relatives to the cops. You're a cold, ruthless bitch. Kevin had hit the most vulnerable part of my work. An architecture firm relies entirely on client trust. I specifically marketed myself on designing homes where the elderly and families could live safely. If a video like this circulated, even if it were proven false later, my reputation would plummet. Clients would abandon me before the truth ever came out. If you don't want that, tell the cops outside to leave right now, Kevin ordered arrogantly, fully believing he had the upper hand again. Tell the lawyer to leave too, and wire $10,000 into my account as an apology. Do that, and I'll delete the video. They had resorted to the most despicable tactic imaginable, holding someone's life hostage. Maya, just go tell the cops it was a misunderstanding. Michelle looked up at me, mocking me. If you had just given us the money quietly, none of this would have happened. This is all your fault. They thought they had won. They truly believed that against the absolute threat of this video, the lawyer's knowledge and the police outside were powerless. Maya, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry I read that note. My mother covered her face and collapsed on the sofa in tears. Her small back shook violently. The thought that she was the reason her daughter was being blackmailed was completely breaking her mind. I sat next to my mother and wrapped both of my hands around hers. Mom, are you okay? It is going to be absolutely fine, I said in a deliberately calm, strong voice. A fake video like that isn't going to destroy my life, so please don't cry. I slowly stood up and faced Kevin and Michelle again. My face held none of the despair or terror they were hoping for. There was only quiet, icy rage. I didn't yell. I didn't scream. I just quietly pointed out their stupidity. Kevin, you two truly are irredeemable pieces of trash. At my words, Kevin's smile twitched. Stop acting tough. I'll really hit send. He shoved the screen in my face. I didn't back down an inch. Beside me, Foster let out a small, exasperated sigh. Kevin, you took that video this evening, didn't you? I pointed out the fact abruptly. Kevin looked slightly shaken. How did you? Because behind my mother in the video, the sky outside the kitchen window is glowing red from the sunset. I stared coldly at the screen of his phone. This evening, you went to the ATM downtown and got an error. You realized the account was frozen. Panicking, you rushed home, realizing the police might be on their way. So, you hurriedly forced my mother to film this video as blackmail material against me. My deduction was flawless. Kevin couldn't argue back. The hand holding his phone began to tremble. Who cares what you think? As long as I have this video, you're finished, he yelled desperately, but his voice had lost all its confidence. I delivered the final blow. Kevin, you think that video is your ultimate weapon. But look closely at the background again. I stepped closer to him. Look at the glass doors of the china cabinet behind my mother. Kevin reflexively looked down at his own screen. The moment he noticed what was reflected in the glass, every ounce of emotion drained from his face. It was the definitive proof that shattered his illusion of victory into a million pieces. A few seconds later, the police outside would finally open the living room door, and he would realize just how doomed he was. Look closely at the background of that video, my cold voice urged. In the video, my mother was reading the fabricated confession in tears. But I wasn't pointing at my mother. I was pointing at the dark, polished glass doors of the china cabinet directly behind her. There, illuminated by the faint red light of the sunset, was the mirror-like reflection of Kevin holding the camera. And that wasn't all. In Kevin's other hand was a long, dull, heavy metal object. It was the solid steel shoehorn he had been trying to use to pry open the console table drawer. In the reflection, Kevin had the metal shoehorn raised high above my mother's head, threatening to strike her. Every time my mother choked on a word, the reflection showed the metal bar twitching aggressively. A hollow, wheezing sound escaped Kevin's throat. This was not a voluntary confession video. Kevin had recorded himself wielding a weapon and threatening an elderly woman to read a fake document, and he had graciously saved it to his own phone. Do you understand now? I said, my voice completely devoid of emotion. The video you made to destroy my life is actually irrefutable video evidence that will send you to federal prison for coercion and aggravated assault. All the strength left Kevin's hand. The smartphone slipped from his fingers and crashed onto the hardwood floor with a heavy thud. As if using that sound as a signal, the heavy footsteps in the hallway stopped right outside the living room door. The knob turned, and the door opened slowly. The crisp, cold night air rushed in, washing away the suffocating smell of greasy chili and human greed. The first to step inside were two uniformed police officers. At their imposing presence, Michelle let out a short shriek and backed against the wall. Kevin couldn't even pick up his dropped phone. He just stood there with his mouth hanging open. We received a call about this address, the older officer said firmly, his sharp eyes scanning the room. Behind him stepped Carter, the investigator. But they weren't alone. Two other people followed Carter inside. One was a well-dressed older gentleman, the local Adult Protective Services caseworker. The other was Mrs. Davis, an old family friend, and our next-door neighbor. The once quiet living room was suddenly filled with adults, creating a legal and social dragnet that completely isolated Kevin and Michelle. "Sarah!" "Mrs. Davis cried out, rushing over to the sofa when she saw my mother trembling. "Oh, I am so sorry. I should have said something sooner." Mrs. Davis held my mother's freezing hands and teared up. "Maya, I knew something was wrong with this house for weeks," she said, her voice shaking as she looked at me. "Every night, I heard this man screaming at Sarah. I saw him forcing her to pull weeds in the yard without a coat on in the freezing cold. Whenever I tried to say hello, she looked terrified and ran inside." Mrs. Davis wiped away angry tears. "Sarah is the sweetest woman. She loves her garden." Seeing her terrified in her own home, I knew it wasn't normal. The APS caseworker spoke up authoritatively to the police. "I have also reviewed the evidence from Investigator Carter. There is overwhelming suspicion of daily physical and psychological elder abuse by this couple. We are here as witnesses." Kevin and Michelle had believed that as long as they hid behind the closed doors of a family relationship, their crimes would never leak out. They thought if they kept my mother locked inside, no one would notice. But the truth was different. The neighbors and social workers had noticed their abnormal behavior and were genuinely worried about my mother. I had instructed Carter to gather them here specifically to utterly crush the "it's just a family dispute" excuse. With this many third-party witnesses, the police could no longer dismiss it as a civil matter. "And no, this is a misunderstanding," Kevin screamed like a madman, waving his hands at the officers. "We're family. We just had a strict argument about household rules. Do you raise a metal shoehorn to threaten people over household rules?" Foster calmly picked up the dropped smartphone and showed the playing video to the officers. The officers' eyes instantly hardened as they watched Kevin raising a weapon against a terrified elderly woman. "Kevin, is it?" "There is clear evidence of coercion and assault here." The older officer took a slow step toward Kevin. "Furthermore, the attorney has submitted evidence of theft and attempted extortion. You're coming with us." The weight of those words broke Michelle. She collapsed to the floor, crying. "No, I don't want to be arrested. I had nothing to do with it. He did everything on his own." She pointed frantically at her husband, initiating an ugly blame game. "Shut up. You're the one who spent Sarah's money buying expensive meat and going to luxury spas." Kevin turned red and screamed back at her. The two people who had been acting so high and mighty moments ago were completely gone. Willingly throwing their own spouse under the bus to save themselves, that was their true nature. I looked down at their pathetic squabble with dead, emotionless eyes. My mother was being comforted by Mrs. Davis, finally shedding quiet tears of relief now that the tension had broken. Just as the officers grabbed Kevin's arms to take him away, Carter spoke up. "Officers, could you wait just one moment?" Carter, who had been standing silently by the door, stopped them in a low voice. He held a single, old photograph in his hand. "They are hiding one more undeniable lie." The moment Kevin saw the photo, his knees gave out completely. He froze in the grip of the officers. His eyes widened, and his facial muscles twitched violently. It was as if Pandora's box, which he thought he had buried at the bottom of hell, had been pried open. "Kevin, earlier you claimed that your business failed, you had nowhere to go, and you came to this house begging for help out of sheer desperation. Correct?" Carter's calm voice echoed in the dead silent room. Kevin couldn't answer. He just panted heavily, staring at the photo. Carter handed the photo to the officers and me. It was a grainy black and white printout of security camera footage. The timestamp was from exactly 3 months ago, long before Kevin's business went under or the debt collectors started chasing him. The photo clearly showed Kevin sitting in the driver's seat of a strange car parked on the street right in front of our house, staring up at the property. "This is from a neighbor's security camera," Carter stated the cold facts one by one. 3 months ago, you still lived in your own house and ran your business. You didn't have nowhere to go. The officer's expressions shifted from dealing with a family dispute to looking at a calculated, dangerous criminal. "You had scoped out this house and Sarah, who lived alone as a specific target 3 months in advance," Carter said. "Mrs. Davis gasped. "Scoping it out? So they didn't just come here randomly for help?" "Correct. This was a premeditated, highly malicious targeting," Carter replied. I felt a chill run down my spine looking at the photo. 3 months ago. That was exactly when I gave an interview to a famous architectural magazine. The feature was titled, "Giving Back to Mom, a warm, custom wood home for safe, independent living." In the interview, I proudly talked about the design of this house. I also mentioned that I travel overseas frequently for work, and bragged about the security features I installed to keep my mother safe while I was gone. Kevin must have read that article. He realized a distant relative's daughter was a wealthy architect, and that an elderly, timid widow was going to be left completely alone in a brand new house for weeks at a time. Anticipating his business failing, he selected the safest, most lucrative target to parasite off of. It wasn't a coincidence that he came begging for help. From the very beginning, he had meticulously planned to hijack this house and suck my mother's assets dry. The sheer depth of that vile malice made me nauseous. No, I just happened to be driving by. Kevin squeezed out a pathetic excuse, but his voice had zero conviction left. Carter ruthlessly silenced him with the next piece of evidence. A person just driving by wouldn't have a printout of Maya's architecture firm's public schedule sitting on their passenger seat. Carter pointed to the passenger seat in the photo. The zoomed-in image clearly showed a printed page from my firm's website detailing my upcoming business trips. Kevin had known the exact day I was leaving for my 3-week trip, and had been lying in wait. The reason you barged in here the day after I left, it wasn't a coincidence, was it? My voice was surprisingly cold and quiet. I realized for the first time that when anger crosses its absolute limit, human emotions become as clear and cold as ice. Kevin was pale as a ghost, his knees shaking violently. My mother slowly looked up from the sofa. Her cheeks were tear-stained, but her terrified expression was gone. So, it wasn't my fault, she whispered into the room. She had been blaming herself the entire time. She thought her own foolish kindness in letting relatives inside had caused this nightmare. She believed her poor judgment had defiled her daughter's house and almost cost me my career. But the truth was different. They were professional con artists who approached her with the sole intent of deceiving and consuming her. You did nothing wrong, Mom? I smiled at her, then turned back to Kevin. You didn't just use my mother's kindness. You used my love for her as bait for your plan. I took a step toward Kevin. He tried to back away in terror, but the officers were right behind him. There was nowhere to run. Kevin, you crossed a line you should absolutely never have crossed. At my quiet declaration, Kevin lost his words, his mouth just opening and closing. The despair of having his shallow lies completely stripped bare by a professional investigator and a lawyer had broken his spirit. The officers silently pulled his arms back. The excuse of a family squabble was dead. Premeditated fraud, attempted extortion, and coercion. There was more than enough evidence to arrest him on the spot. But as the police went to drag him out, Foster spoke up one last time. Please wait. We are not quite finished. Foster's icy voice stopped the officers. Kevin's face twisted in further despair, wondering what else there could possibly be. But Foster's gaze wasn't on Kevin. It was on Michelle, who was shivering in the corner. Michelle, you are sitting there acting like a victim, but don't think for a second you are escaping this, Foster said. Michelle jumped. I have nothing to do with this. He planned the whole thing and forced me to go along with it. Michelle waved her hands frantically, ready to sell her husband out to save her own skin. Foster pulled one final document from his file. We know exactly where the $5,000 you withdrew from Sarah's account over the last 3 weeks went. Michelle's face changed color the moment Foster named the documents spread on the table. They were receipts from a high-end luxury spa in the city, and copies of receipts from designer boutiques. The dates perfectly matched the days following the $500 ATM withdrawals. The receipts were clearly billed to Michelle's name. Michelle, you just claimed you were a victim forced to follow your husband. Foster glared at her coldly over his glasses. But the $5,000 stolen from the mother's account was entirely spent on your own personal luxury. The blood drained from Michelle's face. No, Kevin won big at the casino and gave me that money as an allowance. She piled on desperate lies, her voice cracking. She covered her face and started fake crying. I didn't know it was stolen from Sarah's account. I was tricked too. Her sheer audacity, refusing to admit fault, blaming her husband, and trying to run away was pathetic. This was the ultimate fate of the woman who had proudly declared, "This is our house," just an hour ago. I stepped quietly next to Foster. Michelle, if you're going to lie, at least try to be smart about it. At my freezing voice, her fake crying stopped abruptly. I took the tablet Carter handed me and tapped the screen. Let's see if you really didn't know. I pressed play, and clear audio rang out in the quiet living room. Hurry up and tell me the PIN number. It was Michelle's own shrill, irritated voice. If you keep stalling and the limited edition bag I want sells out, what are you gonna do? In the recording, my mother's small voice apologized repeatedly. Sorry doesn't fix it. Look, I'm keeping the bank book and the debit card. The pin is your birthday backward, right? Got it. A loud slap against a table was recorded. Michelle's face froze in absolute terror and humiliation. This is audio from the landline's recording function, which I triggered remotely from overseas, I said. It was absolute proof that Michelle had personally threatened my mother near the living room phone and physically taken the card herself. Her lie that she was just following her husband was completely obliterated by a few seconds of audio. You took the initiative to rob my mother, and to avoid being caught on camera, you made Kevin go to the ATM at night to withdraw the daily maximum. Ah. A meaningless sound leaked from Michelle's mouth. Her bright red lipstick was grotesquely smeared from her trembling. She was the mastermind who threatened my mother and stole the money out of pure greed. Foster even had handwriting analysis, proving that the signature at the spa perfectly matched the signature at the pawn shop where she sold my father's watch. Michelle, do you have any idea how the $5,000 you blew on spas and bags was made? I didn't raise my voice. I didn't think a woman like her was worth yelling at, but I spoke the truth with quiet, burning fury. My mother put her hands into freezing water in the middle of winter to scrub toilets barehanded. My mother looked up in surprise. Her fingers would crack and bleed, and she'd wrap them in layers of bandages, smiling and telling me it didn't hurt at all. My vision blurred slightly. She hasn't bought herself a new winter coat in 20 years. She walked miles to find groceries on sale, just to save one extra penny for me. My mother sat on the sofa, looking down at her rough hands, crying silently. The money you spent to satisfy your cheap vanity was filled with my mother's blood, sweat, and her love for me. I stepped closer to Michelle. You used violence to steal it, and then tried to blame your husband and run away. Michelle's knees finally gave out. She slumped to the floor, covering her face with both hands. This time, the tears weren't fake. Realizing all escape routes were cut off, she wept genuine tears of despair as the weight of her crimes and her social ruin finally set in. Theft, attempted extortion, and coercion. Foster delivered the final, ruthless verdict. You are both equal accomplices. You can confirm your marital bonds down at the precinct. The two officers silently grabbed Kevin and Michelle by the arms. The grip was strong enough to prevent any resistance. They no longer had the right to speak. Let go of me. I had nothing to do with it. She did it on her own, Kevin screamed, being dragged pathetically toward the front door. No, no, help me, Sarah. We're family, aren't we? Michelle screamed frantically, reaching her hand out toward my mother. But my mother quietly closed her eyes and hid behind Mrs. Davis, completely ignoring the pathetic screams. Any sympathy she had for them was entirely gone. With a loud thud, the front door closed. Outside, the red spinning lights of the police cruisers cut through the darkness through the frosted glass. Silence returned to the living room. Only the grease-stained table and the empty beer cans remained as traces of the abnormal reality that had been here. After the police took them away, Carter tipped his hat slightly. My work here is done. I will leave the rest to Mr. Foster and the police. Please take care, Sarah. Carter quietly left. Mrs. Davis and the caseworker also thoughtfully excused themselves. Maya, I'll come help you clean up tomorrow. Get some rest tonight. Let us know if you need anything. We're on your side. Leaving us with warm words, they went home. Finally, it was just the two of us left in the house. The only things remaining were the smell of cheap perfume and the countless scratches on the hardwood floor. Is it over? My mother exhaled deeply on the sofa. Her voice held 3 weeks' worth of terror and exhaustion. I sat next to her and gently pulled her small shoulders into a hug. Yeah, it's over, Mom. But as I said that, my heart wasn't completely clear. Just kicking the villains out and handing them to the police wasn't a true resolution. As long as the cold, cruel memories they left behind clung to my mother's heart, this house would not return to being her sanctuary. I had one last thing I absolutely had to do. The final decision to restore this house into a place where my mother could truly smile. I stood up slowly and looked out the living room window, which still smelled of chili. The cherry tree in the yard swayed in the night wind, making a faint rustling sound. I squeezed my mother's hand once more and quietly opened my mouth. The next morning, the pale, cold light of dawn filtered through the large living room windows. The house was dead silent, as if the storm of the previous night had all been a lie. I had stayed up the entire night. At 10:00 a.m., the doorbell rang. Foster stopped by on his way back from the precinct. Wearing his usual crisp suit, he stepped into the living room and set his briefcase down. He calmly gave me an update on Kevin and Michelle. Kevin was still yelling about it being a minor family dispute right up until they got to the station, Foster said, taking a sip of the hot tea I poured for him. But the moment the detective placed the ATM footage and Michelle's spa receipts on the table, and especially when they showed him the video reflecting him raising the metal shoehorn, Foster exhaled quietly. His voice stopped completely. He didn't scream, and he didn't violently act out. He couldn't even drop to his knees to beg for forgiveness. He just lost his words entirely, sank deep into the cold metal chair in the interrogation room, and stared at the floor. His thick hands resting on his knees just kept shaking. Faced with the overwhelming reality of being completely surrounded by inescapable evidence, his bravado crumbled to dust. Michelle was the same. Foster lowered his eyes. At first, she tried to fake cry and say her husband forced her to do it. But when confronted with handwriting analysis proving she pawned your father's watch, she looked away. She never raised her head again. They had no more exaggerated excuses, and no one left to blame. Only the heavy silence of knowing their lives were definitively over crushed them. Please leave all upcoming legal procedures to me. Foster shook my hand warmly and left the house. When the front door closed, I stood in the center of the living room again. With their arrest and their lies destroyed, the legal problems were entirely solved, but the house still bore the heavy traces of their malice. The heel marks on the floor, the beer and grease stains soaked into the wood table, the lingering smell of cheap perfume and chili. I made a quiet decision. Mom, today we are going to do a massive deep clean. I tied my apron, rolled up my sleeves, and smiled at her. This wasn't just cleaning. It was a physical ritual to entirely scrape their existence out of this house at a cellular level. First, I threw the cushions they sat on, the glasses they used, and that tacky pot straight into a massive garbage bag. Anything they had touched went straight into the trash without a second thought. Next, I pulled sandpaper from my toolbox and approached the cherry wood table, the spots where Kevin had slammed his beer and where Michelle had spread her makeup. I forcefully sanded down the stains. The rhythmic, scratching sound echoed in the quiet living room. Wood dust fluttered to the floor like quiet snow. When you sand down the surface of solid wood, a beautiful new grain appears. It felt like I was generating new skin over my mother's wounded heart. My hands were covered in dust, and sweat beaded on my forehead, but I didn't stop. My mother was aggressively scrubbing the kitchen floor with a rag, the corner where she had been banished for 3 weeks. As if purifying the space with her own hands, she worked in silence. We didn't say much, but through our actions, we were surely rebuilding our bond. At 3:00 p.m., the doorbell rang. A delivery driver handed me a small package. The sender was Carter. I opened the box and pulled out a small cloth bag. The moment I felt its weight, my chest grew hot. Mom, come here for a second. My mother washed her hands and returned to the living room. I handed her the bag. Carter sent this. Looking confused, she took the bag and slowly pulled out the contents. The moment she did, her eyes widened, and massive tears began to spill down her cheeks. It was my father's silver pocket watch, the one Michelle had sold for $30. Carter had tracked down the pawn shop the night before, and before anyone else could buy it, he went through the legal channels to purchase it back. The surface still bore the tiny scratches from when my father used it every day. Honey, honey. My mother held the pocket watch in both hands and pressed it tightly against her chest. She cried out loud like a child. My mother, who had endured 3 weeks of terror and tried to act brave yesterday, finally broke the dam on her emotions the moment she got the watch back. I didn't say anything. I just gently rubbed her back. I knew the cold metal of the watch was slowly melting the terror frozen in her heart. By evening, the deep clean was finished. We opened the windows, letting the crisp, cool spring breeze blow through, completely erasing the foul smells. The sanded solid wood table regained its warm cherry color, breathing quietly in the center of the room. The house had finally returned to its true form. Mom, let's make dinner, I called out. Yes, let's. She smiled gently, but I didn't miss her slight hesitation. She didn't walk toward the restored table. Unconsciously, her feet drifted toward the cold wall in the corner of the kitchen. Oh, sorry. She stopped and smiled awkwardly. The physical dirt was gone. The criminals were legally punished, but the trauma of being treated like an intruder in her own home for 3 weeks didn't vanish that easily. Deep down, she was still afraid to stand proudly in the center of her own house. I made a quiet resolution. Just kicking out the villains wasn't my true goal. My goal was for my mother to feel from the bottom of her heart that this is my home, and to sit at the dinner table with a full, bright smile. That was the final, and most important, conclusion to this story. I took my mother's hand and gently led her out to the back porch as the sun began to set. The cherry tree in the yard stood quietly. Spring was still a little way off, but the branches were covered in tight, hard buds. The cool evening breeze rustled the branches. We sat side by side on the porch. The solid wood floor still held a faint warmth despite the cold air. I looked at my mother's profile next to me. There were still faint tear tracks on her cheeks. The frustration that leaving her alone for just 3 weeks had caused her so much pain pricked at my chest. I wrapped both my hands around her rough ones again. "Mom, earlier, you unconsciously tried to go to the corner of the kitchen, didn't you?" She gasped and looked down. "I'm sorry." Standing there just became a habit. When you get yelled at so much, you start to feel like you're just in the way. Her words were heartbreaking. She had been made to feel like a nuisance in her own home. The emotional scars Kevin and Michelle left were deeper than I thought. "Listen, Mom," I said slowly, looking out at the cherry tree. "Do you remember what I told you 10 years ago when I built this house?" She tilted her head slightly, narrowing her eyes to search her memory. "I told you that when I finally became an independent architect, my very first project was absolutely going to be building you a new house." I gently stroked her cracked fingertips. "You worked from morning to night to put me through college. When Dad died and I was screaming and crying, you hid your own grief to hold me. And when I got married, and then lost my husband, my throat burned just thinking about it. You drove all the way to my house every day to make warm meals for me when I was frozen inside. The only reason I am alive today, the only reason my work can bring smiles to people's faces, is entirely because of you." My mother listened in silence. Quiet tears threatened to spill from her eyes again. "I didn't build this house to show off a fancy building. I wasn't trying to protect these hardwood floors or the latest kitchen appliances." I looked straight into her tear-filled eyes. "I built it so you could eat warm meals every day with a smile, so you could watch whatever TV shows you want without deferring to anyone, and sleep in a warm bed. I poured my entire life into designing this house for that single reason." Her shoulders trembled slightly. "So, Mom, if this house is going to make you feel like you have to hold back, if it makes you hide in the corner out of fear," I squeezed her hands tighter and declared clearly, "I would rather call a bulldozer and tear this whole place down right now." The moment she heard those words, she gasped sharply. "No, Maya, don't say that." She frantically squeezed my hands back, shaking her head violently. "This is the treasure you worked so hard to build for me. I would absolutely hate it if you tore it down." Seeing her desperate face, I smiled gently. "Right, so, you have to protect this house. You have to live proudly in the center of this house every single day." Smiling. "That is how you protect this house." At that moment, I could feel the frozen block of terror inside her shatter and fall away. She pressed her face against my chest and cried loudly, like a small child. "Dad's watch came back too. Dad was protecting you in this house," I said. "Yes, he was, wasn't he?" She gripped the silver pocket watch against her chest as if it were the most precious thing in the world. The faint ticking echoed quietly between us. It sounded like the time that had stopped out of fear in her heart was powerfully moving forward again. "I will never go to the corner again. I won't hold back in the house my Maya built for me," she said with a strong voice. Hearing that, the dark clouds in my own heart completely cleared. We sat on the porch, crying and holding each other until it got dark. It was the moment of reconciliation where we truly took our lives back. Nearly 6 months passed. The seasons cycled, and a warm spring finally visited the once cold yard. Foster gave me one final report on Kevin and Michelle. The two of them were formally indicted, and both received heavy federal prison sentences for theft, attempted extortion, and coercion. Thanks to Carter, the stolen money was fully recovered from hidden accounts he tracked down. They are now sitting behind cold iron bars, facing the heavy consequences of their own foolish sins. But to my mother and me, their existence was already a distant thing of the past. My architecture firm was thriving. Through this incident, I gained a much deeper understanding of what a home truly means. When drawing blueprints for clients now, I don't just chase beautiful designs. I prioritize imagining the smiles of the family who will live there. The houses you design feel so warm and safe, Maya. Lately, I've been hearing those happy words from clients more and more. That, too, was a lesson taught to me by this house and my mother. On a weekend evening, I finished work early and headed to my mother's house. Opening the front door, the harsh perfume and cold air were completely gone. Instead, the house was filled with a warm, savory, gentle aroma. "Welcome home, Maya," my mother's bright voice called from the kitchen. Opening the living room door, I found a picture of perfect, happy daily life. My mother stood at the lowered kitchen counter I had designed, happily preparing dinner. "I'm making a huge batch of your favorite homemade fried chicken and mashed potatoes today." Color had returned to her plump cheeks, and a genuine smile radiated from her face. On her feet were the brand-new, fuzzy pink slippers I had bought for her. The terrified woman shivering in the corner of the kitchen that night was nowhere to be seen. I washed my hands in the bathroom and walked to the cherry wood table in the center of the living room. The table I had sanded down was piled high with golden brown fried chicken. "Wow, it looks amazing! Your fried chicken is the best in the world!" My mother's eyes crinkled with joy. "Eat as much as you want. I'm going to fry even more." Her bouncy voice echoed pleasantly off the walls. I opened the glass door to the back porch. A soft spring breeze blew into the living room. In the yard, my mother's favorite cherry tree was finally in full bloom. The pale pink petals caught the sunset, sparkling as they danced through the air. One petal rode the breeze into the living room, landing softly on the solid wood table. I looked at the blooming cherry tree with a grateful smile and returned to the living room. The relatives who tried to steal this house mistakenly believed that a home was just an expensive asset. They thought that simply living in a big, new house would automatically make them happy. But the true value of a home is not determined by its size or its price tag. No matter how grand the mansion, if the people living inside are terrified and crying, it is nothing but a cold prison. The only thing that breathes life into the vessel of a house is the warm emotions of the family living inside it. Being able to spend time smiling and feeling truly safe, without having to defer to anyone. Sitting around a warm dinner table, laughing and talking about the trivial events of the day, I finally realized from the bottom of my heart that this was the only true wealth worth protecting. "Maya, the sweet tea is ready. Let's eat while it's hot," my mother called out, bringing 2 glasses of iced tea to the table. "Coming." My mother and I sat across from each other at the table. We didn't sit at opposite ends of the room. We just sat close together at our warm dining table. "Let's eat," we said in unison, biting into the hot fried chicken. The satisfying crunch and savory juices filled my mouth. My mother looked at me and smiled gently. The moment I saw that smile, I felt every last trace of anxiety and pain completely vanish from inside me. The long, cold war to take my life back was definitively over. I would protect the rest of my mother's life with my own 2 hands. I swore strongly in my heart that I would ensure she could spend every day until her last with a full smile like today in this peaceful house surrounded by cherry blossoms. As my mother and I laughed loudly together once more,